The radio crackled at 4:47 a.m., pulling Dr. Marcus Webb from shallow sleep. He'd been dreaming of clean sutures and predictable wounds. Black bear lacerations, cougar abscesses, the routine traumas of Olympic National Forest wildlife. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah Chen, the park's senior ranger, and her tone carried an edge he'd never heard before. "Marcus, we need you at Queets River Basin. Now, bring your emergency kit and everything for a large mammal." "And Marcus?" She paused, static filling the gap. "Come alone. No questions until you're here." He dressed in the dark of his cabin, October rain drumming against the windows. At 38, Marcus had spent 15 years treating injured wildlife across Washington state, but Sarah's voice had contained something beyond urgency, a kind of disciplined fear. He loaded his veterinary duffel into the Land Cruiser. Antibiotics, sutures, analgesics, instruments sterilized the night before for a scheduled elk examination. The forest roads were slick with fallen leaves, and fog clung to the cedar canopy like wet wool. By the time he reached the coordinates Sarah had provided, dawn was a pale suggestion behind the clouds. Her truck sat at the edge of a logging road, headlights extinguished. She emerged as he parked, her face drawn and sleepless. "Before you see this," she said quietly, "I need your word. What we document here stays between us until we understand what we're dealing with. No calls, no reports, nothing digital." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Sarah, if there's a public safety, there's a life," she interrupted, "a life that doesn't fit any protocol we have. Your word, Marcus." He nodded slowly. She led him down a game trail, their boots squelching in mud, until they reached a natural depression sheltered by a massive fallen spruce. And there, in the grey morning light, Marcus Webb's understanding of the world fractured cleanly in two. The creature lay on its side, breathing shallowly. It was enormous, easily 8 feet in length, even recumbent, with a barrel chest rising and falling in laboured rhythm. Reddish-brown hair covered its body in thick, matted layers, darkened with mud and blood. But it was the face that stopped Marcus's breath. A broad, flat countenance with a prominent brow ridge, a wide nose, and eyes, half-closed in pain, that held an unmistakable depth of awareness. The right leg bore a savage wound, torn flesh exposing muscle and possibly bone, with the characteristic puncture pattern of a bear attack. "Jesus," Marcus whispered. "Found it 3 hours ago," Sarah said. "Or it found us. There were vocalizations, not bear, not elk, nothing in any database. When I tracked the sound, it was here. It didn't flee. It looked at me. Then it looked at its leg." Marcus forced his professional training to override the shock. He knelt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and visible. The creature's eyes opened fully. Dark amber irises, the sclera bloodshot but distinctly structured, and tracked him with focused intelligence. Not the blank wariness of an animal, but the assessment of a thinking being. "I'm going to examine the wound," Marcus said aloud, his voice steady. "I won't hurt you more than necessary." The creature's gaze held his for 3 long seconds. Then, with visible effort, it shifted its injured leg slightly toward him. Consent. Marcus's hands trembled as he opened his kit. He'd treated grizzlies under sedation, but this required no drugs. The creature remained still as he cleaned the wound with saline, its breathing measured despite what must have been excruciating pain. The damage was severe: 4 deep lacerations through the gastrocnemius, partial exposure of the fibula, heavy contamination from soil and organic matter. Without intervention, sepsis was certain. With his intervention, he was practicing medicine on an unknown species with unknown physiology. "I'm using a broad-spectrum antibiotic," he narrated, drawing cefazolin into a syringe. "Intramuscular injection. There may be compatibility issues, but infection will kill you faster." He found a relatively clean site on the creature's left shoulder and injected slowly. A low rumble emanated from its chest, not aggression but acknowledgement. Marcus worked for the next 40 minutes, debriding necrotic tissue, irrigating with antiseptic solution, applying surgical staples where the tissue would hold. The creature never flinched, never pulled away. though sweat, yes, sweat, dampened the hair around its face. When he finished the primary closure and wrapped the leg in a pressure bandage, Marcus sat back on his heels. His shirt clung to his back, despite the autumn chill. The creature's breathing had deepened, more regular. It raised one hand, a hand not a paw, with an opposable thumb and fingernails worn short, and touched the bandage gently, exploring the texture. "You'll need follow-up care," Marcus said, more to himself than the patient. "The wound needs daily cleaning, fresh dressings, probably another round of antibiotics in 12 hours. The creature turned its head to look at him fully. Then it did something that would haunt Marcus's dreams for years to come. It brought that same hand to its own chest, fingers spread over the heart, and then extended the hand toward him, palm up. The gesture was unmistakable across any cultural boundary. "Thank you." Sarah had been photographing everything with a film camera, no digital record. Now she lowered it and met Marcus's eyes. "What are we looking at?" Marcus's mind raced through graduate courses in comparative anatomy, evolutionary biology, primate morphology, the sagittal crest, the brow ridge, the body proportions. Everything screamed Gigantopithecus, but that genus had been extinct for 100,000 years, unless it hadn't been. Unless a remnant population had survived, adapted, hidden in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. "Something that shouldn't exist," he said finally, "and something that thinks." The creature made a soft vocalization, almost questioning. Marcus noticed details he'd missed in the initial shock. The intelligent placement of leaves beneath its body for cushioning. The deliberate way it had positioned itself with its back to a sheltering root mass, the problem-solving architecture of survival. "We have maybe 6 hours before hypothermia becomes critical," Sarah said. "It's lost blood, and this temperature, we can't move it," Marcus interrupted. "Not without equipment, sedation we haven't tested, and a destination we don't have. But we can improve conditions here." He looked around the depression, calculating. "We need thermal insulation, a waterproof cover, and a way to monitor without constant presence. It needs rest more than observation." They spent the next hour transforming the natural shelter into a viable recovery space. Sarah retrieved emergency thermal blankets and a tarp from her truck, while Marcus rigged an IV line. The creature allowed the needle placement with only a low grunt, and started a slow drip of lactated ringers to address dehydration and shock. They insulated the ground with cedar boughs and positioned the tarp to create a roof while maintaining airflow. Through it all, the creature watched them with that unnerving awareness. When Marcus checked the IV flow and adjusted the bandage, it lifted its hand and touched his wrist, not restraining, just contact. The skin was warm, calloused, unmistakably primate. Up close, Marcus could smell it. Earthy, musky, but not unpleasant, like forest soil and cedar bark. "I'll come back in 6 hours," Marcus said directly to the creature, "with more medicine and fresh bandages. You need to stay still. Let the wound begin healing. Do you understand?" The creature's eyes never left his face. Then, slowly, it nodded. One deliberate dip of the head. Sarah gasped softly. Marcus felt the world tilt again. Nodding wasn't universal. It was learned, cultural. This being had observed humans closely enough to adopt the gesture. As they gathered their equipment to leave, Marcus made a decision that violated every principle of scientific documentation. "No one else sees this," he said. "Not yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with and what revealing it would mean." "The ethical implications," Sarah began, "are exactly why we wait," Marcus said firmly. "If this gets out, this place becomes a circus. Researchers, trophy hunters, government agencies. That creature survives by remaining unknown. We just became the only humans it's trusted in. How long? Decades? Centuries? We don't repay that with exposure." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "But we keep records. Sealed records. If something happens to us, someone needs to know." They hiked back in silence, the forest dripping around them. At his truck, Marcus looked back toward the shelter, invisible from this distance. Somewhere in that depression was a living link to humanity's deep past, a separate people who had chosen invisibility over contact, and he had just made a promise he might not be able to keep. The drive home felt surreal. Marcus's hands ached from tension, and his mind couldn't settle. He thought about the wound, the infection risk, the possibility of rejection or allergic reaction to the medication, complications he couldn't predict. But more than that, he thought about the hand on his wrist, the weight of trust in that touch. At his cabin, he pulled every text on primate physiology from his shelves and began reading, searching for any research that might explain what he'd treated. Gigantopithecus blacki, the largest known ape, had existed in Asia until approximately 300,000 years ago, but no fossil evidence placed it in North America. Could a related species have crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the Pleistocene? Could it have survived the extinction that claimed mammoths and saber-toothed cats? His phone rang twice, colleagues, routine calls, but he let them go to voicemail. Sarah had been right. No digital communication. They were operating in a grey zone beyond any legal or ethical framework he knew. By late afternoon, Marcus had assembled a new kit: stronger antibiotics, wound irrigation supplies, electrolyte solutions, and, on impulse, a sketch pad and charcoal pencils. If verbal communication was limited, perhaps visual symbols could bridge the gap. The return hike to the shelter came as clouds broke and rare October sunlight filtered through the canopy, turning the wet forest into a cathedral of light and shadow. Marcus approached quietly, alert for any sign of disturbance or discovery. The tarp remained in place, undisturbed. When he ducked under the shelter, he found the creature sitting upright, back against the fallen spruce. The IV bag was empty, the line carefully removed and placed beside the deflated bag. Manual dexterity and problem-solving. The bandage remained intact. Most striking, the creature had arranged a series of objects in front of itself. 3 stones of graduated size, a broken branch stripped of bark, and a pattern of moss arranged in a clear geometric design. Communication, or cognition, or art. "Hello again," Marcus said softly, kneeling at a respectful distance. "I'm going to check your leg now." The creature extended the injured limb without prompting. When Marcus unwrapped the bandage, he felt relief flood through him. No signs of acute infection, the staples holding, some early granulation visible at the wound edges. The antibiotic had worked. He cleaned the area, applied antibiotic ointment, and rewrapped with fresh gauze. "This is healing faster than I expected," he said, documenting with the film camera Sarah had left. "Your immune system is robust." The creature watched his every movement, but when Marcus finished and sat back, it didn't withdraw its attention. Instead, it reached toward the sketch pad Marcus had set down. He offered it slowly, along with a charcoal pencil. What happened next would change everything. The creature took the pencil with surprising delicacy, adjusted its grip once, then turned to a blank page and drew. Not random marks or experimental scribbles, but deliberate lines. A crude but unmistakable representation of 2 figures, one smaller and prostrate, one larger and standing. The standing figure had something in its hand extending toward the prone one. Medicine. The drawing depicted their encounter. Marcus felt his eyes burn. "Yes," he whispered. "That's what happened. I helped you." The creature turned the page and drew again, this time the same 2 figures but positions reversed. The formerly prone figure now standing, the other in need. Marcus stared at the image, understanding settling like stones in his chest. It was showing him reciprocity, promising reciprocity. Whatever debts existed between them would be balanced. "I don't need repayment," Marcus said. "I did this because it was right." But the creature tapped the drawing insistently, then pointed to itself, then to Marcus, then back to the drawing. The message was clear. This was not optional. It was obligation, duty, perhaps even sacred law in whatever culture it came from. Marcus nodded slowly. "All right, if you need to repay, I accept. But first, you need to heal." The creature settled back, apparently satisfied. Marcus spent another hour in the shelter, checking vitals as best he could. Strong pulse, clear respiration, no fever signs, and leaving supplies for the next day. When he prepared to leave, the creature made a soft vocalization, almost melodic, and touched its chest again before pointing to Marcus. "My name is Marcus," he said, pointing to himself. The creature repeated the gesture, chest, then pointing, but made no sound resembling his name. Instead, it placed both palms flat on the ground, then raised them in a lifting motion. "Earth, or grounded, or rooted. Is that your name?" Marcus asked. "Or what you call yourself?" No response, just that steady, knowing gaze. Marcus left as evening descended, the forest filling with the calls of varied thrushes and the rustle of nocturnal animals beginning their rounds. At the trail's edge, he turned back once more. Somewhere in the darkening forest, a people existed that humanity had relegated to myth, and one of them had just shown him that the boundary between human and other might be far more permeable than science had ever acknowledged. The weight of that knowledge, and the responsibility it carried, settled on him like the gathering night itself. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus Webb fell into a rhythm that divided his life cleanly. The public world of his practice, where he treated injured raptors and deer with familiar confidence, and the secret world of the shelter, where every visit rewrote his understanding of intelligence, culture, and kinship. The creature, he began thinking of it as rooted, the name seeming to fit the grounded dignity of its presence, healed with remarkable speed. By day 5, it was bearing weight on the injured leg. By day 9, the staples came out cleanly, revealing pink scar tissue already maturing. Marcus documented everything on film: wound progression, range of motion, behavioral observations. Sarah visited twice, bringing supplies and maintaining the perimeter, ensuring no other hikers or rangers stumbled across the site. But it was the communication that consumed Marcus's thoughts. After that first drawing, Rooted had become an eager participant in what Marcus came to think of as their pidgin, a hybrid language built from gestures, sketches, and careful observation. On the 6th day, Rooted drew a simple but profound image, a line with multiple branches, like a family tree. At the base, 2 branches diverged. One led to a figure that resembled Rooted, the other led to a figure that resembled Marcus. Above the split, a single ancestor. Marcus's hands shook as he understood. Shared ancestry. Rooted was showing him evolutionary relationship. "We're related," Marcus breathed. "Cousins, different branches." Rooted touched the drawing, then touched Marcus's hand, then its own chest. Family. Not metaphorically, genetically, historically, family. Marcus thought of his graduate work in comparative genetics. Humans and chimpanzees shared 98.8% of DNA. Humans and Neanderthals had interbred, left genetic traces in modern populations. If Rooted's people represented a parallel branch that had diverged perhaps 2 million years ago, maintaining proto-Homo characteristics while developing along a separate path, the implications were staggering. Not cryptid, not animal, people. "How many?" Marcus asked, holding up his fingers, counting visibly. "How many of your people?" Rooted studied his gesture, then picked up the charcoal, drew one figure, then another, stopped at 7, paused, drew 3 smaller figures. Children, Marcus realized, noting the relative size. Then, with visible deliberation, Rooted drew X marks through 3 of the adult figures. 7 individuals, 3 juveniles, 4 adults, 3 of them gone. 4 left, Marcus whispered. 4 adults. Rooted nodded, that adopted human gesture again, and the expression in those amber eyes carried something Marcus recognized from every hospice, every euthanasia, every terminal case he'd ever handled. The grief of dwindling numbers. Marcus felt cold horror settle in his stomach. How? What happened to the others? The drawings that followed told a story written in tragedy. Rooted sketched landscapes, mountains, valleys, rivers, Marcus recognized as the Olympic Peninsula's geography. Then figures moving, small groups. Then specific images, a figure caught in metal jaws, traps, another with lines radiating from its chest, gunshot, a third near a geometric shape that might have been a cabin or structure surrounded by smaller figures. Dogs, Marcus realized, hunting dogs. Humans, Marcus said flatly. We killed them. Rooted didn't confirm or deny, just moved to the next drawing. This one showed figures in dense forest, hidden, watching. A strategy of survival through invisibility. But the landscape around the hidden figures was shrinking, squeezed by geometric shapes, roads, buildings, clear cuts. Habitat loss, Marcus said. We're not just killing you directly, we're erasing the places you can exist. Rooted drew one more image, a figure standing alone, one hand extended toward darkness. The posture conveyed something beyond loneliness, an existential solitude, the last speaker of a dying language. Marcus had to look away. In his veterinary career, he'd worked with endangered species, wolves, condors, right whales. But those had conservation programs, legal protection, international attention. Rooted's people had none of that. They had only anonymity, and anonymity was failing them. I want to help, Marcus said carefully, but I don't know how without destroying what protects you. Rooted seemed to consider this, then drew a new image. The shelter where they sat, then Marcus approaching with his medical kit, then Marcus leaving. A simple cycle. Then beside it, a different image. Many figures approaching, some with cameras, some with weapons, some with cages. The surrounding forest cut and cleared, the shelter exposed. You're showing me the cost of discovery, Marcus said. If the world knows you exist, this ends. The protection of mystery is lost. Rooted nodded emphatically, then drew one more thing. A single line from the figure representing itself to the figure representing Marcus, and symbols Marcus slowly interpreted as memory or witness. A vertical line with 3 horizontal marks, tallying, counting, recording. You want me to remember, Marcus said slowly, to witness, not to reveal, but to know, to keep the knowledge. Rooted touched the drawing, then touched Marcus's forehead gently, a gesture so human-like it made Marcus's throat tighten. Remember, carry this. The ethical vertigo was overwhelming. Every scientific instinct demanded documentation, peer review, publication. This was the discovery of the millennium, proof that human uniqueness was an illusion, that multiple human-like lineages had survived into the modern era. But that same discovery would doom the discoverers. The 4 remaining individuals would be hunted by curiosity as effectively as by bullets. I need to think about this, Marcus said, about what helping means, what protection means. Rooted didn't push, just returned to sketching. Over the next hour, it drew images of its people's life, figures gathering plants Marcus recognized as salmonberry, yew, and devil's club, figures sheltering in root caves and natural formations, figures moving at night, avoiding human trails. It was an ethnography rendered in charcoal, a cultural record entrusted to an outsider. One drawing caught Marcus's attention, figures arranged in a circle around a small raised mound, heads bowed, a burial. Rooted drew with particular care here, adding details of stones arranged in patterns, branches woven into specific shapes. You bury your dead, Marcus said. You have rituals. Rooted met his eyes and drew one more thing, a figure lying down, covered in leaves and branches, with one hand extended upward, holding something. A stick or tool, Marcus couldn't tell. Grave goods. The archaeological signature of symbolic thought, of belief in an afterlife, or honoring of the dead. How long? Marcus asked. How long have your people been here? Rooted drew a landscape, then layers beneath it. Strata, Marcus realized, a geological timeline. Then a sun position lowered to the horizon, repeated over and over, moving across the page. Seasons, years. Finally, Rooted drew a vast number of marks, far more than Marcus could count, and then an image of ice covering the mountains. Since the Pleistocene, since the glaciers, tens of thousands of years of parallel existence. The sun was setting when Marcus finally prepared to leave. His mind reeled with information, with responsibility. Rooted walked him to the shelter's edge, walked easily now, the limp barely noticeable. At the trail, it made a soft, complex vocalization, almost like speech but not quite. The anatomy slightly different. Marcus tried to replicate it, failed, tried again. Rooted shook its head gently, then touched its own throat, then Marcus's. Different instruments. The larynx, the vocal tract. Evolution had shaped them differently. Full linguistic exchange might never be possible, but the gestural language they'd built was enough. "I'll come back in 2 days," Marcus said, "and I'll think about how to help without harming." Rooted nodded, then did something unexpected. It reached into a natural hollow in a nearby cedar and withdrew a flat stone, about 6 inches square. On the stone surface were carved marks, deliberate, geometric, clearly intentional. Symbols, writing. Marcus breathed. Rooted pressed the stone into his hands, then drew in the dirt. The same divergent tree diagram from before, but this time with a circle around both branches. Unity. Despite divergence, unity. "I'll keep this safe," Marcus promised. "I won't show anyone without your permission." Rooted touched its chest, then Marcus's forehead again, that gesture of memory, of witness. Then it turned and moved into the darkening forest with a silence that seemed impossible for something so large, the shadows swallowing it completely within seconds. Marcus stood alone on the trail, holding a carved stone that represented proof of non-human intelligence, of a culture that had existed in the margins while humanity built civilizations, fought wars, and sent rockets to the moon. He thought of the 4 remaining individuals, the 3 juveniles who might be the last generation if something didn't change. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with the stone in front of him, a lamp throwing harsh light across the carved symbols. They weren't representational, not pictures, but abstract marks arranged in patterns. True symbolic representation. He photographed the stone from every angle, then locked it in his office safe. The next day, Marcus made a decision. He called Sarah and arranged a meeting at his cabin, ensuring no electronic trail. When she arrived, he showed her the drawings, the documented wound healing, and finally, the stone. "We're witnesses to an extinction," Marcus said quietly. "Or we could be participants in survival, but I don't know which choice does more harm." Sarah held the stone reverently. 4 adults, 3 children. That's genetic bottleneck territory. Even with conservation support, populations this small rarely recover. And conservation support means exposure, Marcus finished, which means their survival strategy, invisibility, is destroyed. "Could we provide resources without revealing them?" Sarah asked. "Medical supplies left in secure locations, monitoring from a distance. Protection of habitat through policy, but without naming the reason." Marcus considered it. "We'd need to establish communication protocols. Teach them to recognize supply markers, safe zones. It would require trust both ways. They'd have to believe we're not luring them out for capture." "Can you ask them?" Sarah said. "Rooted, can you communicate that level of complexity?" Marcus thought of the drawings, the emerging language. "I think so. I think Rooted understands survival as negotiation. But there's another issue." He pulled out a topographic map of Olympic National Forest. "Look at their range. Based on what Rooted showed me, they're confined to maybe 20 square miles. That's all that's left undeveloped enough for their needs. One major fire, one development project, and that's gone." Sarah traced the boundaries with her finger. "This section falls under federal wilderness protection. It's legally secure. For now," Marcus said. "But laws change. Administrations change. Without someone knowing why this specific area is critical, it's vulnerable. So we need a conservation legacy, Sarah said slowly. Something that protects the land without exposing the people. They spent hours strategizing, building a framework of protection through misdirection, expanded endangered species surveys that would legitimize increased ranger presence, proposals for habitat corridors justified by spotted owl populations, budget requests for undisclosed sensitive resources, bureaucratic camouflage. 2 days later, Marcus returned to the shelter with a new proposition sketched out in simple diagrams. He found Rooted waiting, along with another individual, smaller, more slender, with darker hair and eyes that held the same penetrating intelligence. The second figure stayed back, wary, but Rooted made a soft vocalization and gestured for Marcus to enter. "I brought a proposal," Marcus said, kneeling in the neutral space between them. He drew 2 figures representing Rooted's people, and then a protective circle around them. Then he drew himself and Sarah outside the circle, with arrows representing supplies moving inward, medical symbols, food symbols, danger warnings. "We help from outside," Marcus explained. "We don't enter your territory unless invited. We bring medicine, warn you of threats, protect your land through human systems, but you stay hidden. You control contact." Rooted studied the diagram for a long time, then turned to confer with the other individual. They communicated through gestures and soft vocalizations, a complex exchange Marcus couldn't fully pass. Finally, Rooted drew a question. A figure with an X through it, then an arrow pointing to Marcus, then a drawing of many figures surrounding. "If one of us dies," Marcus translated, "will I bring others?" It was the crux question, the trust point. Marcus met Rooted's eyes. "No. When you die, all of you eventually, your people's existence dies with you. I'll keep the memory, but I won't reveal it. The world will never know you existed." He paused, the enormity of the promise settling on him. "Unless you choose otherwise." Rooted and the other conferred again. Then Rooted drew something new, a figure standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out at a horizon. Below the cliff, many small figures. And beside the cliff-standing figure, a single other figure, Marcus, clearly, watching the same horizon. Companionship in witness. Not savior and saved, but 2 beings watching something precious disappear together, sharing the grief and the responsibility. "Yes," Marcus whispered, "that's what this is." Rooted extended its hand, palm up. Marcus placed his palm against it, skin to skin, warmth to warmth. The other individual watched, but didn't flee. A small step toward acceptance. They formalized the arrangement over several visits. Marcus established a supply cache 3 miles from the shelter, marked with a specific pattern of broken branches Rooted could recognize. He left antibiotics, wound dressings, high-calorie food packets, water purification tablets. Within days, the cache was empty, replaced by a stone with a simple carved mark, acknowledgement. The system worked. Marcus and Sarah maintained their public duties while secretly stewarding an invisible population. Marcus treated the juveniles when one developed a respiratory infection, a careful, tense encounter with 3 young individuals huddled beside Rooted, their enormous eyes tracking his every movement. Sarah diverted hiking groups away from sensitive areas, citing unstable terrain or sensitive habitat restoration zones. It felt sustainable. It felt like they'd found a balance. But sustainability requires static conditions, and the forest was never static. The warning came in February, 5 months after Marcus's first encounter with Rooted. A developer had submitted proposals for a luxury eco-resort on private land adjacent to the federal wilderness, 200 acres with planned access roads cutting through the remaining buffer zone. The public comment period had passed largely unnoticed, the project moving through approval channels with bureaucratic efficiency. Sarah brought the news to Marcus's cabin, her face ashen. The main access road would run directly through the eastern valley. "That's where you saw signs of the juveniles, isn't it?" Marcus felt cold spread through his chest. "That's their primary foraging area. Late summer berries, winter root plants. If construction starts, heavy equipment, constant human presence, habitat fragmentation, Sarah finished. They'd have to relocate or risk exposure. Relocate where? Marcus said flatly. Their range is already compressed to minimum viability. There is nowhere else. They spent the next week exploring options. Legal challenges were impossible without revealing the reason for concern. Buying the land would require capital they didn't have and questions they couldn't answer. Alternative proposals for conservation easements went nowhere. The developer had invested too much to back out, and the local county saw the resort as economic opportunity. Marcus hiked to the shelter, his mind churning. He found Rooted alone, working on something Marcus initially couldn't identify. Branches woven into a complex structure, too elaborate for shelter, too deliberate for random activity. "We have a problem," Marcus said without preamble. He drew the map, showed the proposed road, the construction zone. "Your territory. Humans are building here. Many humans for many seasons. You'll be forced to move or be discovered." Rooted studied the drawing, then stood and walked to the edge of the shelter, made a low, mournful vocalization that carried through the trees like wind through stones. Within minutes, the other 3 adults arrived. Marcus had never seen them together, and the sight was overwhelming. 4 towering figures, the last adults of a lineage stretching back millions of years, gathering to hear a death sentence. Rooted explained, gesturing to Marcus's drawings, pointing toward the eastern valley. The others responded with vocalizations, gestures, clear distress. An argument developed. Marcus couldn't follow the specifics, but positions were clear. The smallest adult gestured toward the deep wilderness, toward relocation. Another gestured toward staying, toward hiding better. The third, the largest and greyest, gestured toward Marcus, toward the human world, a question or proposal. Finally, Rooted turned back to Marcus and drew something that stopped his breath. A figure standing in an open space, surrounded by many small human figures. Cameras. Recognition. The end of invisibility. "You want to reveal yourselves," Marcus said, shocked. "That's suicide. You know what humans do." Rooted drew another image, a territory marked with barriers, signs, protection symbols. Then small figures, the juveniles, growing larger, older. Survival through visibility. "You think exposure would bring protection?" Marcus said slowly. "Legal status, conservation law." Rooted nodded, but the other 3 were clearly opposed. The argument resumed, more heated now. The grey one made sweeping gestures of negation. The youngest drew frantically in the dirt, images of cages and confinement Marcus recognized from zoo structures. "They're afraid," Sarah said quietly. She'd arrived mid-discussion, drawn by the vocalizations. "They've survived by hiding. Visibility feels like death." Rooted drew one more image, a figure lying down, covered in leaves, the grave symbol. Then 3 small figures alone. Then those figures also lying down. No next generation. "Die unknown," Marcus translated, "or risk everything for a chance." The enormity of it crushed him. This wasn't his decision. These were sovereign individuals choosing their species' fate. But they were asking his counsel, his understanding of the human systems that would judge them. "If you reveal yourselves," Marcus said carefully, "humans will be amazed, fascinated. Some will want to protect you, but others will want to study you, capture you, own you. You'll lose all privacy. Scientists will want your blood, your DNA, your children's development data. The government will argue over jurisdiction. Some humans will say you have rights, others will say you're animals. The fight will take years, and you'll be in the middle of it, exposed and vulnerable." Rooted drew the question again. Better than extinction. Marcus thought of conservation successes, whooping cranes brought back from 15 individuals, black-footed ferrets recovered from near extinction. But those were animals. Rooted's people were something else, something the law had no framework for. Were they human under the Constitution? Did they have legal standing? Could they be forcibly relocated, studied, confined, for their own good? "I don't know," Marcus admitted. The honest answer is I don't know if it's better, but I know this. Once you're visible, you can't go back. That choice is permanent. The group conferred for over an hour. Marcus and Sarah waited at the shelter's edge, watching the gestures grow more sparse, more tired. Finally, the grey one made a definitive gesture, staying, hiding deeper, refusing visibility. The youngest and the other adult agreed. Solidarity in tradition. Only Rooted remained uncertain, caught between wisdom of experience and desperation of circumstance. In the end, Rooted drew a simple image, a forked path. One path led to the human symbols of visibility. The other led deeper into forest symbols, toward wilderness. At the fork stood a single figure, not moving. "You can't decide," Marcus said. Rooted touched the drawing, then touched its own chest, then gestured to the other three. Consensus. They needed consensus. "Then I'll give you information, and you'll decide together," Marcus said. "This is what I know about human law and conservation." He spent the next hour sketching out frameworks. Endangered Species Act provisions, federal trust territories, the legal status of intelligent non-humans, speculative, untested, timelines for protection implementation, risks of poaching, challenges of enforcement. Sarah added details about ranger capabilities, monitoring technology, protective custody scenarios. The four listened, asked questions through gestures, and discussed. As dusk fell and rain began pattering on the tarp, they reached their decision. Rooted drew the fork again. This time, the figure moved down the path toward deeper wilderness. But beside that path, Rooted drew Marcus, walking parallel, separated by a line but moving in the same direction. "You're choosing invisibility," Marcus said. "But you want me to continue helping." Rooted nodded, then drew something new, a cash symbol repeated in 3 locations on the map, supply points. Then a small figure with medical symbols, teaching Marcus to treat the juveniles remotely. Finally, a stone with marks, more carved records, more cultural memory transferred to an outside keeper. "You're making me your archivist," Marcus said, understanding. "Your memory holder." Rooted touched Marcus's forehead again, that gesture of witnessing, but this time with a weight of finality. Whatever happened, Marcus would carry their story. When the last individual died, years or decades from now, he would be the only one who knew they'd existed. The last witness to a people who'd walked beside humanity for hundreds of thousands of years without recognition. The responsibility was crushing. It was also an honor beyond measure. "I'll do it," Marcus said. "I'll remember, and I'll help for as long as I can." The four touched their chests in unison. Gratitude, trust, farewell. Then the 3 others melted into the darkness, leaving only Rooted. "The road construction starts in 3 weeks, Marcus said. "You'll need to relocate before then. I'll scout the deep wilderness, find water sources and shelter sites, leave supply caches on the route. But Rooted," he paused, struggling with words, "the territory is so small. Every year there's less room. Eventually, there won't be anywhere left to hide." Rooted drew one final image, a horizon with a sun setting. Below it, a single hand reaching upward, touching the last light, ending with dignity. "You know," Marcus whispered, "you know this is the last generation." Rooted didn't confirm or deny, just gathered the drawings and ceremonially burned them in a small fire, smoke carrying their deliberations skyward. Then it retrieved an object from the woven structure Marcus had noticed earlier, a larger stone tablet, twice the size of the first, covered in carved symbols. A history, a cultural record, a testament. "You're giving me your memory," Marcus said, taking the tablet with shaking hands. Rooted placed both hands over Marcus's, pressing down gently. "Keep it, guard it, remember us." Then Rooted did something Marcus would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. It drew itself close, wrapped long arms around him in an embrace that transcended species, and made a soft, melodic vocalization that sounded like mourning and gratitude twined together. Marcus felt tears on his face, unsure if they were his or Rooted's. the distinction meaningless. When they separated, Rooted touched its chest one last time, then Marcus's chest, then pointed to the stars barely visible through the rain. Same sky, same world, same ending for all living things, but some endings are witnessed and some happen alone in silence. Not alone, Marcus said. You're not alone. I'm here. I'm remembering. Rooted nodded once, then turned and walked into the forest. Marcus watched until even the sound of footsteps faded, leaving only rain and the whisper of cedar branches. He hiked back through darkness, the stone tablet wrapped carefully in waterproof canvas. At his truck, he sat for a long time, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Somewhere in the night, 4 adults and 3 children were preparing to move deeper into shrinking wilderness, their existence sustained by secrecy and stubbornness. The resort would be built. The roads would scar the valley, and humanity would never know what it had displaced. Over the following weeks, Marcus established the new supply caches Rooted had requested, each placed with meticulous care in areas inaccessible to casual hikers. He scouted the deep wilderness zones, finding caves and natural shelters, marking maps he would never share with anyone but Sarah. The construction began on schedule, diesel engines roaring through the valley, and Marcus felt each felled tree like a personal wound. He maintained the caches for 3 years. They were used regularly, supplies depleted and replaced, occasional marks left in acknowledgement. Once, Marcus found a small woven object, a token, a gift, beside an empty cache site. He kept it in the safe beside the carved stones. Then gradually, the caches stopped being emptied. 1 season passed, then another. Marcus hiked deeper, searching, finding nothing but old signs, faint prints, territorial markers, long cold fire sites. The forest kept its secrets. He didn't know when the last one died. There was no body, no evidence, no closure. Just absence where presence had been. The supply caches sat untouched until weather destroyed them. The carved stones remained locked in his safe, a message from a people who existed between myth and extinction. Sarah retired from the park service 5 years after that first morning call, the secret weighing on her more each year. On her last day, she asked Marcus, "Did we do the right thing? Keeping silent?" "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "But we kept our promise. We witnessed. We remembered." Marcus continued his veterinary practice, treating injured wildlife with the same care he'd given Rooted. But something had changed. Every bear, every elk, every crow, he saw them differently now, as kin in the deep sense, fellow travelers through evolutionary time. The boundaries he'd once drawn between human and animal felt arbitrary, constructed, false. He began writing in the evenings, not for publication but for record, a sealed account held in his attorney's custody with instructions to be opened only after his death. The story of Rooted, of 4 adults and 3 children, of a people who chose dignity and silence over survival through spectacle. Sometimes, hiking the old territories, Marcus would find a stone placed just so, or a pattern in broken branches that might have been deliberate. Probably wind, probably chance, but maybe not. Maybe somewhere in the deep wilderness, 1 or 2 had survived longer than he knew, maintaining the tradition of invisibility, watching humanity with ancient eyes. He carried the carved tablets with him always, wrapped and protected. On his chest, he wore a small token, the woven object left at the cache, hidden beneath his shirt. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the quiet intensity, but attributed it to age or grief for unnamed losses. 10 years after the last cache emptying, Marcus stood at the edge of the eastern valley, now transformed by the resort. Tennis courts where berry thickets had grown, swimming pools where streams had run. Tourists laughed and played, unaware they walked on ground sacred to a people they would never know existed. He thought of Rooted's drawings, the forked path, the choice made. They had chosen their ending, prioritized autonomy over preservation. It was the most human decision imaginable, and it had doomed them, or maybe not doomed, maybe honored. Maybe there was dignity in making that choice, in saying we exist on our terms or not at all. Marcus touched the woven token under his shirt and spoke quietly to the empty air. "I remember, I witness. You were here, you were people, you mattered." The forest kept its silence, but in that silence, Marcus felt something like peace. He had been trusted with a species' final testimony. He had been chosen as memory keeper for a people without written history, without monuments, without any trace but what lived in his mind and the stones in his safe. When he died, years later, peacefully in his cabin surrounded by books and photographs and a lifetime of wildlife care, his attorney opened the sealed account as instructed. Inside were the tablets, the drawings, the photographs, the written testimony of 4 adults and 3 children who had walked beside humanity for millennia before vanishing into the mist of extinction. The account included specific instructions. The information was to be held in academic trust, accessible only to researchers who agreed to protect the specific locations, who understood that verification was impossible and unnecessary, who could honor a people not through scientific validation but through respectful memory. Some called it elaborate fiction. Others saw it as testament to indigenous knowledge long dismissed by Western science. A few, the ones who understood deep time and the fragility of existence, recognized it as precisely what Marcus claimed: a record of encounter, an ethical attempt to honor autonomy while holding memory, a story of how humanity's expansion writes endings for more than just abstract species, but for peoples, cultures, ways of knowing. In the archive, beside the tablets and photographs, was a final note in Marcus's handwriting. "They asked me to remember when remembering was all I could offer. They chose invisibility over survival, because survival without autonomy was a death of another kind. I cannot prove they existed. I can only testify that I encountered thinking beings who extended trust across a boundary humans claim is absolute, and in doing so, they changed what it means to be human. If you read this, honor them not with belief or skepticism, but with humility. We share this world with more than we know, and sometimes the greatest service is to guard a secret, carry a memory, and accept that some endings happen quietly, witnessed only by those who loved what was lost. They repaid my medicine with the gift of truth, that humanity is not alone in personhood, never was, and that our uniqueness is a story we told ourselves while other stories were happening in the margins, unheard. Remember them. They were here. We walked the same ground, breathed the same air, and for a brief, precious moment we knew each other. That is enough. The archive remains sealed, accessible to researchers who understand that some knowledge serves not to claim or prove, but to honor. Somewhere in Olympic National Forest, the land continues its cycles, indifferent to the grief of those who remember what was lost. And in that indifference lies a mercy. The forest keeps the secret that 4 adults and 3 children kept, protecting their memory as they once protected their existence. In silence, in shadow, in the space between myth and extinction, where all impossible things go to be forgotten, but Marcus Webb remembered. And in remembering, he gave them what few extinct peoples receive: a witness who loved them enough to let them choose their ending, and then to carry that choice forward as testimony that existence is not measured by survival, but by the autonomy to decide one's own terms of being. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to experience more tales that bridge the scientific and the emotional, exploring what it means to share this world with minds we've only begun to understand. Stories like these remind us that consciousness, culture, and kinship extend far beyond the boundaries we've drawn. And sometimes, the most profound encounters are those that change us in ways we can never fully share.